Okay, for part two of our funeral science videos, we are going to look at restorative art. All right, restorative art is a very tricky one to be able to memorize or to apply in the sense of a test because there are so many procedural things. So, again, we're going to look at some ways to hone in on how you can better identify ideas when you're reading questions and maybe the direction to go. Now, also, what's important to recognize with restorative art is if you're working in a prep room with somebody, ignore what they do when it comes to taking a test. Learn from them, of course, when you are in their presence and doing something together. But a textbook can only write out steps in order, and it's a suggestion, especially when it comes to trauma, cosmetics, people, things like that. They're all different. The extent of the things are all different. So I'm going to give you some ideas on how to follow along when you are looking at questions, but kind of keep that stuff in mind. All right, so you have to be able to separate what you're learning from in a prep room from what it actually says in your textbook because unfortunately, the embalmer you're working with is not analyzed for test questions. Your textbook is. Okay, so first of all, a large portion of what you learn in restorative art relies on your understanding of anatomy, right? And I'm not going to sit here and go through every single one of your bones, muscles, skin markings, or any of that stuff because that's what your textbook is for and your past lessons and your notes. But what I'm going to offer you instead that as you're studying, you need to learn the Latin or Greek vocabulary that is attached to it. Why? Because frequently they will tell you location and function. Bones, muscles, and facial markings all um, follow this, right? So, like for example, a real simple one, bone, your frontal bone. Okay, we know that's in the front of your face. Um, or your temporalis, right? Okay, that's your temporal bone, the side of your head. Your temples, you've probably heard it before. And then it also tells us the muscles. Now, the muscles get a little bit um, more difficult, right? So, like for example, we have um, levator palpebrae, um, which is a location and a function, right? It is the elevator of your eyelid. So knowing those words means that instead of just memorizing something super long, you're going to be able to see them in different contexts. So if you learn a word that as it applies to a bone, then you're going to be able to learn that again as it applies to the muscles. Now let's take a minute and look at the facial markings, right? Like for example, nasolabial fold. Well, if you pay attention to the word nasolabio, and if you're asked about a definition, you'll know that it is the fold between your nose and your lips, nasolabial. Now, one of the things that people really have difficulty um, doing is reading the whole question. All right. When you see nasolabial fold, don't think nasal sulcus, right? Because that's another one. Nasolabial sulcus, nasal sulcus. People frequently get these two mixed up. Nasal sulcus just has nose in it. So if whatever definition you're looking for, look for something that just describes the nose. If you see nasolabial, well, that describes something your nose and your lips. So in the definition, you need to look for something that says something about both the nose and the lips. So that is the value of learning the Latin and Greek vocabulary when it comes to anatomy, because they frequently tell you location and function or shape. So you need to make sure that you are following along with that. All right. because just memorizing a bunch of long words isn't going to help you. All right. Got to know the vocabulary and what each one of those words means. That goes for anatomy as well. Trauma. When it comes to restorative art, trauma is very tricky. All right. Because as I mentioned on the outset of this, it's that you have so much variation in damage done during trauma. So when it comes to trauma, you have to just be mindful of what you might assume and what the answer is. Like, for example, a tricky question here might be about embalming during um, uh, with a gunshot wound, right? What do you do? Do you suture the gunshot wound first and then embalm the person, or do you leave it open during embalming? Well, in this example, you're supposed to leave it open. Why? Because a sutured gunshot wound will swell. So you got to let the fluid flow. Also, just kind of as a side, it will let you know if your arterial fluid's getting there. And then on top of that, coming into contact with it will also embalm the parts of the gunshot wound. Another thing that you need to do is you need to identify what the problem is and its difference from others. Like a big one here would be burns, right? There's a big difference between a first degree, a second degree, and a third degree burn, right? And how you treat it. First degree burn, not really too much of a problem. Your biggest problem is probably dehydration. Whereas a second degree burn has blisters. Big difference because now we have potential concentrated decomp in that area. We have the blisters to deal with. We actually have surface problems that we have to deal with. And then a third degree burn, of course, is charred skin. So you may have to do something like remove any charred skin post embalming to be able to suture it closed. Your wax applications might be different for those, whereas a third degree burn might require a basket weave stitch with thicker wax on top of it, whereas a second degree burn would have something a little bit lighter before you cosmetize on it. So you have to be able to recognize the different levels of trauma and their differences. Um, my advice to you also is always remember how to solve the embalming issue first, and then the RA problem comes next, right? So, like in my previous example with a second degree burn, okay, well, first of all, you have to drain the blisters, and then you have to cauterize the area before you can add wax to it and cosmetics, all right? So that's kind of like the difference. You have to be able to get it step by step. So if you're unsure of what direction to go with, think about what needs to be done to solve the embalming problem, and then you will be able to have the idea of um, how to fix the restorative art problem. And that will keep you generally on the correct track when you don't know what to do. All right, so then wax is also kind of important when it comes to trauma. You got to recognize the density of the different waxes, wound filler versus lip wax, and how adhesive that each one of these are. All right, and then where it belongs, the depth. Wound filler. Okay, if you have a lot of damage, that may require wound filler. If it's surface damage, then some sort of medium wax or lip wax, just depending on what it is. That's important. Then also, when do you apply the wax, and then when do you apply the cosmetics? Typically, the order of that sort of thing when it comes to wax is the application of wax, then any texturing, and then cosmetics, right? Because you want to think about, well, if I cosmetize this wax and then texture it, it's going to disturb all the cosmetics that I just did. All right, when it comes to sutures, very important to recognize the purpose of the sutures, right? So is it an aesthetic restorative art suture or is it for security? Like for example, an intradermal stitch, that is not, there's not a lot of security there, right? Versus a lock stitch, which is only about security. So you need to know that, and then in what situation we are thinking about, right? So like a good example of this is like, say I have a big cut on my face, right? And it's the tissue is really split. What kind of suture am I going to use here? You might be thinking to yourself, intradermal. All right, well, that's not a lot of security, and I have a big cut on my face. And the other thing you have to remember is if I have a big cut and I go to bring the edges of the tissue together, look at what happens to my face, right? Now I'm distorted. So that's when the things like the basket weave comes into play. because then your features don't get stretched out and you can apply wax over it. So it's important to recognize that. And then, as I already mentioned, the wax's density and applications when it comes to what sutures you have chosen to do, right? Like an intradermal suture, again, might use a little bit of a lighter wax over it because the idea is to hide it, and might not handle very much. But a baseball stitch, for example, you might be able to use a thicker wax, or might need to use a thicker wax because there's more visibility in the bites in the suture. Okay, color theory. First of all, you need to spend some time learning your definitions of all the complements and color harmony and all that other stuff. That's all I can tell you. Don't because you say to yourself, um, that I went to kindergarten and I know exactly what it is that I'm doing already when it comes to kindergarten level stuff. So, no, you don't. And you need to memorize those definitions. Now, how do we apply it? All right. Well, got to remember your complements and how the color correctives are applied there, right? So generally, when we have a color corrective, this is why we learn about complements, is so you know the opposite to cancel it out. So in my example, we have the green from jaundice post embalming. Well, what is the opposite here? Red. Okay, pretty simple. We're going to put a little bit of red to cover the green, and then after that, because generally what that is doing is that is going to be able to um, at least dull out the green. So then that way you'll be able to put regular cosmetics over the top of it. Okay, so what about um, highlighting versus shading? All right, remember that highlights make things more prominent. One way that I remember this, highlight. Okay, it is there to reflect lights. These are going to be colors that are lighter, white, light pinks, stuff like that. And they are frequently done in higher places. And by that, I mean ones that, like when a person is in the supine position, are going to be the higher areas. If you look at this person's face, right, you can see where her cosmetics have been used to highlight here on her cheeks, right, and then on her nose, and then a little bit in her forehead. Okay. Now, shading obviously is going to be in recessed places, or they're used for contouring. Okay, so what shading is you have to remember is that this is the foil to highlights. So we see she has shaded in her supraorbital region. We also see a little bit of shading here underneath her cheeks. So we have the highlighted cheeks and then the darkened cheekbones below it to highlight the higher parts of her cheeks. Now, people who use cosmetics on the regular probably do this naturally because they know. But this is what they're talking about when, for those of us who aren't used to using cosmetics or are just now learning this in mortuary school. So that's how you got to kind of remember it. And then finally, adding red. For some reason, this always seems to be kind of a problem for people when it comes to cosmetics. Now, I want you to take a look at this plastinated head, and I want you to look specifically where you see the most red, all right? The most red areas. Cheeks, chin, here you go. The temples, right here. The nose, all right? See where we have all the gatherings of your blood vessels, all right, that is going to be the reddest parts of your face in general because that's where the blood vessels are most plentiful and closest to the surface of the skin. So when we're thinking about adding red, think about this picture or reference it, all right, because that is going to be the places. Another way that I remember is I think about where my face gets red when it gets cold. All right, those are those same kind of areas. Cheeks, right? Nose. This dude has a beard, so you can't really see it, but chin, parts of your forehead. Same goes with your hands, right? Your knuckles are the spots where your blood vessels are closest to the surface of your skin. So when you're cosmetizing those areas are going to be a little bit redder than the rest. All right. And then let's not forget your ears. Think about how red your ears get when they're cold, right? And they get the most red up here. So I know it's difficult to know where to add red, but if you are asked about a place where to add the most red, think about where it is that you get the most cold. And then finally, we need to remember our feature math, right? One ear equals one nose, for example. All right. We also need to remember our feature alignment. All right, because that tells you where your features fit in amongst the rest of them in a generally normal sense, right? We call these classic proportions. Of course, because nature doesn't follow any rules really. You might have a nose that's a little bit wider or a mouth that's a little bit wider, but for all intents and purposes, when we're starting with just a blank face, these are the rules that we need to think of is our feature alignment rules. The other thing is that people frequently forget supplemental equalities. This is roughly a two-third measure length of your face that helps you determine where the other thing should be. All right. So, especially when it comes to like a protrusion, right? I like this, especially when I'm building the restorative art armatures, the heads, to see how far my nose is supposed to stick out because I know where a forehead is and I know where the base of the nose is going to be based on the nasal spine. And then I can kind of know how far the nose is going to stick out because I can tell where the ear passage is. So I know that this is a supplemental equality from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, and then also kind of the widest part of your face. So I hope this will help you navigate your restorative art questions just a little bit better by thinking about and being able to pinpoint those different concepts about it rather than drowning yourself in definitions. If you have the background of the vocabulary, that will tell you a lot about the anatomy. Um, Remembering simple things like where red is and the color correctives, right? Knowing the damage to the tissue will help you think of the color corrective. And then trauma is always difficult, but remember, address the embalming problem first, and then you'll know what to do from there. And then also when it comes to things like burns, gunshot wounds, things where there's a lot of variables or there's different named levels of them, understand that the differences between those and then the restorative art application will be a lot easier. All right, so I hope this is helpful you, and we'll see you in part 3.